Okay, so let's now turn to this hemodynamic body of research on Broca's area. So we've of course already met Broca's area in the context of the classic model of language in the brain, where Broca's area was associated with language production, Wernicke's area with language comprehension, very kind of simple model. And so now you should be a little bit surprised about the role of Broca's area in this literature on syntax. It makes sense to be surprised. So let's kind of go over. So how did Broca enter the neuroscience of syntax? Exactly what is the history behind this? I'm going to take you on a little tour. So starting with stuff we've already covered. So remember, Paul Broca performed the first localization of language function in the brain and studied the patient Tan, who had this very severe production problem. And that is what led to the hypothesis that Broca's area is some kind of a language production region, somehow responsible for the production part of language. And step 2, Carl Wernicke identified this more posterior patch of cortex that seemed to be more responsible for comprehension. So he studied a set of patients who had this very fluent and disordered speech and very, very severe comprehension deficits. So that led to this hypothesis that Wernicke's area is associated with comprehension and that's with auditory representations of language. Okay, so that's your classic model already looked at. And then there's sort of a different development about 100 years later. So researchers in the 70s and early 80s, so for example, Karamazov and Zurif, they started noticing that Broca's aphasia also had comprehension deficits. So their problems didn't seem to be limited to language production. And the deficits seem to have a kind of a specific nature, and that is that these patients would fail on sentences that were syntactically more complex, and specifically sentences where in order to really interpret them, you have to correctly compute the syntax. So for example, a sentence where there is a reversal of the canonical roles of the participants. So for example, if I have a sentence like the cat was chased by the mouse, well, there, in order to figure out that it is actually the mouse that's the chaser, you have to really compute the right syntactic structure. You don't get the right interpretation by just like working with the idea of like what would be the most plausible interpretation of that sentence. And so it's those kinds of expressions that seem to be particularly problematic for Broca's aphasics. So here, like easy, girl chased the boy would be totally fine. The boy was chased by the girl, a little bit harder. Has that kind of reversal. So that kind of gives rise to this hypothesis that maybe Broca's area has something to do with syntax. And then in 1996, Karen Stromswold performed a very influential PET study where she also examined these syntactically more complex sentences that had, the kinds of structures that Karamazov and Zurif and others had noticed to cause problems for Broca's aphasics, and examined them in a neuroimaging study. And so here, what they then found was that those harder sentences, which were these center-embedded sentences, engaged Broca's area more than syntactically easier sentences. And so I'm going to show you that in a little bit more detail in just a sec. But whenever I teach this topic, I like to go online and sort of ask Google what Google thinks is the most prominent syntax region of the brain. And so I just did that again today. And in fact, Google still does think that the inferior frontal gyrus, so that's basically Broca's area, is, that is the answer that Google gives you if you ask it where in the brain we kind of execute our syntax. So this hypothesis is prominent, and it's something that like this is what you find out if you as a layperson try to get the answer to this question. So it's important for us to understand what the evidence for this hypothesis actually looks like. Okay, so let's just take a quick peek at the Stromswold et al. Study. So what they found out was that if we manipulate the difficulty of syntactic processing, so on the one hand, you have something that's kind of an easy structure to compute, and then you have a harder structure. The harder structure seems to engage Broca's area. And so specifically, they use the center embedded versus right branching structures. I will try to give you the idea behind these constructions without getting into any kind of gory details. So here's the example of this kind of center embedded structure. The juice that the child spilled stained the rug. I've color-coded the kind of important part of the stimulus or the expression, and that is that the juice here is expressed as the first element of the sentence. It's a thing that you pronounce first, but really we want to be associating it with disposition as the object of spilled because it's the thing that is being spilled. Okay, so that is a so-called long distance dependency in syntax where there is this dependency between these two positions. So something is pronounced here, but really semantically, there's a sense in which it sits right here. So that's a relatively long distance. You get this other material. In the meanwhile, you have to hold the juice in mind and then integrate it in this position. And that's known to be a little bit difficult. So even if completely healthy participants, you can measure like reading time delays for expressions like this. And we can then contrast it with a so-called right branching structure where there is not such a long dependency. So you don't have to keep the element in mind for as long. The child spilled the juice that stained the rug. So here, the juice is the subject of the sentence, and you don't have to keep it in mind for a long time. Okay, so these authors were relying on a prior psycholinguistic literature that showed that the center embedded structures were a little bit difficult, and so that was sort of a good starting point for a neuroimaging study. There was already behavioral evidence that this is a contrast that matters for your brain. Here you can see the syntactic structures of these sentences. So the center embeddedness refers to the fact that here's my subject of the sentence, the Jews, blah, blah, blah. And in that subject, I'm embedding a whole other sentence. So this is the center embedded clause here. It's embedded in the center of this, in the subject. And so it's kind of a heavy item to process in that position, whereas in the right branching structure, you don't have that issue. Okay, it's a block design. And so what they learned was that if we do like a simple subtraction between center embedded minus right branching, an area of Broca's area, pars opercularis, as a sub area Broca's area, is more active for the center embedded expressions. Okay, so that was an important finding because it kind of resonated with those observations for aphasic patients. So now, like this idea that Broca's area has something to do with syntax is starting to gain momentum. This basic finding has been replicated many different times. Here's so that original study was a reading study. Here's an auditory version, similar results. So just showing you this. So you can kind of appreciate that it's a well-replicated finding. Okay, so of course we want to then understand exactly what the function is that would be implemented in left inferior frontal cortex or Broca's area such that we get these kind of syntactic seeming effects. So it could, of course, be the case that Broca's area does perform some kind of real syntactic computation, like maybe builds those long distance dependencies or something like that. But there were other hypotheses that also were possible. So one very obvious one that you want to kind of wonder about immediately is whether the effect might actually be due to working memory. So the cases that seem to engage for Broca's area more are the ones in which you have to like hold an item in mind for a while and then integrate it at a later point in the sentence. So in order to semantically interpret the expression. And it could be that working memory load that might drive that activation. Okay, so that is a hypothesis that has been very, very extensively explored. So what are some ways that we might test it? I'm going to show you one example of such a study, and we'll walk through it in a little bit of detail. And I like this one because it actually links the syntactic findings on Broca's area back to the possible production role of Broca's area as kind of proposed in the classic model. And so in particular, this study by Korean Rogalski, William Machen, and Greg Hickok, it takes as its starting point an influential hypothesis about how verbal working memory works. So when you're using working memory during language processing. And the hypothesis is that you can keep something in mind in your verbal working memory by subvocally rehearsing that material. So for example, if I want to keep in mind the cat while I'm processing some other material, so I'm like comprehending and I try to keep something upstream in the expression in mind, in my head, I'm actually like sort of saying the cat to me. And then when I need it, I'm able to access it very easily. And so this is Baddeley's famous phonological loop, an influential theory about how verbal working memory actually operates. And so now the interesting part of this is that if this is something that is happening while you're comprehending, well, then there's actually a production mechanism that is kind of working in tandem. And that's what will allow us to link the syntactic results on Broca's area back to the, perhaps fundamental production role that this region has been hypothesized to have. Okay, so the core idea here is that articulatory rehearsal, so now that refers to the sort of like subvocal production process that allows you to keep something in mind, is a process that aids the comprehension of syntactically complex sentences, such as the ones that we've looked at so far, where you have to hold something in mind in order to integrate that expression later. And so here then the idea was that Broca's area, because it is a production area, houses this articulatory rehearsal mechanism. And we would then get increases in Broca's area exactly in those cases where we're engaging the articulatory rehearsal, so the kind of difficult sentences. Okay, so here's the setup of this experiment. The basic idea is that you're listening to sentences that are either complex in the ways that we've described so far or not so complex, or easier sentences. So here's an example of a complex sentence. The man that the boy pushes is wearing a red shirt. Okay, so it's the man is the individual that is being pushed. So you want to be able to link it up with the object position of pushes. Subject is listening to the sentence and then has to indicate which of these pictures is the right match. Okay, so the man that the boy pushes is wearing a red shirt. So it's this middle picture. That's the right match. Okay, so basic idea, pretty clear. But then they have so-called dual task manipulation. So they're imposing a second task on this basic experimental task. And crucially, the second task is a production task. And the reason that is interesting is because the hypothesis that I just articulated for you says that in order to understand a sentence like this, you basically have to like subvocally articulate the man as you're processing the zone that the boy pushes in order to be able to integrate it into this position. That's the hypothesis. And so what these authors did was occupy your production route with something else. So while you're listening to these sentences, your task is actually to simultaneously say badaga, badaga. Okay, so you have to articulate this totally meaningless, otherwise totally easy sequence of syllables, but you're doing it while you're listening to these sentences and trying to do this task. And so the question then is, how badly does that secondary task mess you up? And so now, of course, it's intuitive to think that a secondary task would always mess you up a little bit. And now, in order to be able to say specifically that it is the production task that is messing you up, they also had a control task where you're just tapping a finger. So that's important. So they have two motor tasks that you're doing simultaneously with the tasks, but only one of them engages your speech production system, and the other one is just a motor task. That's just like a secondary task that you have to do. Okay, so now we're interested in how badly does the production task impair your performance on this experimental task. Okay, so here are their results. These object relatives, that refers to these difficult sentences that are hypothesized to require the articulatory rehearsal. And then we have three types of easier sentences. And the darker bars are the articulation cases, and the lighter bars are the finger tapping control task. And so as you can see, the two tasks, the two secondary tasks do not have any particular reliable effect. For the easy sentences, you're able to process all of these expressions pretty well, even though you're doing this other task at the same time. Okay, but when we go to the object relatives, the harder stimuli, we notice that now doing two things at the same time does mess you up for both tasks. But crucially, the articulation task messes you up more. So it really interferes more with your ability to do this matching task. So that is just behavioral evidence. So this is just like experiment one, purely behavioral experiment that shows that these object relatives the comprehension of these object relatives may have some kind of a production component to them. And so then they did the same experiment in fMRI. So now again, you have these object relative expressions, and they're compared to slightly easier subject relative sentences. So the money that the robber stole, money is the stolen thing out here, was in the bank vault, versus the robber stole the money. That was the robber that stole the money was in the bank vault. And so the task was to indicate plausibility for these expressions. So you're just pressing a button if the sentence makes sense or not. A pretty common task. So here's just a reminder of the original Strom-Swold result. Okay, so you get more activity for the harder structure, which would be the object relative structure here. So now we're interested in measuring Broca's area activation. And again, we have the dual task manipulation going on. And so this is now exactly the same region that Strom-Swold identified in the original study. And so here, the first two bars are basically the replication of that original result. So here, object relative elicits a higher activity in this area of Broca's region than the subject relative expression. So those are the easier expressions. No secondary task here. Okay. Let's then jump over here to see what happens during finger tapping. So as you can see, during finger tapping, the bars look pretty much the same as when there was no task at all. So object relative, higher activity than subject relative. So it seems like that secondary motor task really does not interact with what's happening with object relatives and subject relatives. But here in the middle, we have our crucial data then. So now, again, object relatives, they're still high, but what's happened was that the subject relatives have shot up as well. So remember, for the whole time here, you're doing that articulation task. So now, if Broca's area is a production area, this result makes sense because now, even during the processing of the easy expression, you're engaging the production system, and so you get this increased activity. And it's the same amount that you get when you're just doing the bada, gada, bada, gada task. So what this shows us is that by just having that secondary articulation task, or just that articulation task by itself, will give us just as much Broca's area activation as object relatives. So here we see that the articulatory rehearsal elevates the activation level of the subject relative so that there is no longer an object versus subject relative contrast. So it seems like here we're sort of saturating Broca's activity. And so here, what this shows us is that articulatory rehearsal is a possible explanation of these Broca's effects for long distance dependencies. Doesn't show it conclusively, but it kind of presents it as a viable possibility. Because it doesn't show it conclusively, because it could be the case that the activity that we see in the no task case is actually qualitatively different. Like basically, the idea would be that there's really two different mechanisms in Broca's area. One of them is the syntactic one, and then there's also this production-related activity. And so that's sort of a logical possibility. But the study is interesting because it attempts to link this seemingly disconnected syntactic role of Broca's to the sort of original production hypothesis. Okay, so where does this leave us as regards Broca's area, production, and syntax? Well, I'm sad to tell you that there still is no consensus on the role of the LIFG or Broca's area in language or sentence processing. The role of Broca's area in language has probably been the most heavily debated topic in our field over the years, maybe settling down a little bit right now. But I would, certainly wouldn't say that we're at a consensus point still at this point. But what I'm highlighting for you here is that if comprehension involves some production mechanisms, then some engagement of Broca's area could be expected in comprehension, even if the region is fundamentally a production region. And I think that's an interesting direction. And for some further reading, I would like to direct you to a very recent review paper by William Machen and Greg Hickok, so the same group that did the articulatory rehearsal study, where this basic idea is sort of taken further in the context of much more data than what I touched on here. This body of research is a region-driven body of research It takes a brain region and tries to figure out what that particular brain region does. And the original identification of the brain region was not stemming from an interest in a specific computation. And so now the body of work that we'll talk about next is a more computation-driven body of work. So we're interested in like, okay, let's just go back to basics and ask what brain activity is sensitive to the simple act of putting two words together into a larger phrase. So that's where we're headed next.